The nature of global conflict has evolved in the 21st century, with a decrease in wars between countries due to factors such as increased democratization, economic development, international organizations, and various treaties and trade agreements. However, fault lines now more often erupt with societies rather than between nations. Internal conflicts are driven by various factors. 1. Separatist movements of oppressed minorities demanding their own states or greater autonomy. 2. Political instability. 3. Unequal access to resources and societal benefits. 4. Perceived threats to religious and ethnic identities. 5. Food insecurity. 6. Persecution and discrimination. When people lack peaceful means to pursue justice and address grievances, violent conflict may seem like the only option, especially without international intervention. The concept of sovereignty, which guarantees nations the right to independence and self-rule, has inspired many of these internal struggles. However, the principle can also complicate international efforts to intervene in domestic conflicts. As internal conflicts become more prevalent, questions arise about the role of international peacekeeping efforts, particularly those led by the United Nations. There is ongoing debate about whether UN peacekeepers should be given broader mandates to more actively participate in ending violent conflicts within countries, rather than primarily focusing on maintaining ceasefires and protecting civilians. Addressing these evolving conflict dynamics requires a nuanced approach that balances respect for sovereignty with the need to protect human rights and prevent widespread violence. The nature of global conflict has significantly evolved since World War II. Interstate wars have become increasingly rare, particularly after the Cold War, with most of Europe entering a zone of peace that eventually led to the formation of the European Union. Today's conflicts primarily erupt along fault lines within societies rather than between nations. Intrastate wars now account for the majority of the world's political violence. These conflicts often stem from religious and ethnic rivalries, with goals typically focused on either government takeover or secession to establish an independent state. While interstate conflicts below the threshold of war, defined as 1,000 fatalities per year, remain more common, they have generally been low-intensity disputes concentrated in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. However, the potential for escalation cannot be discounted. Modern civil and ethnic conflicts are characterized as irregular wars, lacking declared battles and clear battlegrounds. The distinction between civilians and combatants is often blurred, with entire ethnic or religious groups potentially targeted. Tactics such as rape and civilian massacres are deliberate strategies rather than unintended consequences. Following the Cold War, the number of violent conflicts initially declined, but religious and ethnic rivalries became the primary divides. Civilians now suffer higher casualties than official or unofficial combatants in contemporary wars and political conflicts. The longest-running conflicts, excluding political violence in Colombia, are predominantly ethnic and sectarian wars, where dominated or oppressed groups fight for independence, autonomy, or governmental change. Even after achieving initial objectives, violence often continues due to differing visions for the future government among various nations. Contemporary conflicts have evolved beyond traditional interstate wars, falling into three main categories: state-based, one-sided, and non-state conflicts. State-based conflict involve a government fighting organized groups, while one-sided conflicts pit groups like ISIS or Boko Haram against civilians. These irregular forms of combat are often classified as hybrid wars, blending various aspects of degenerate and state-decaying conflicts and mixing private and state forces, motives, and technologies. Globalization has eroded states' monopoly on legitimate violence, making unilateral force against other states nearly impossible. Transnational military alliances, international norms, and the destructive capacity of modern weaponry further limit states' ability to act independently. Within nations, failing political and economic systems, particularly in autocratic regimes, create power vacuums filled by organized criminal groups, paramilitaries, and rebel factions. These actors use violence to pursue their specific goals, contributing to the complex landscape of modern warfare. The landscape of global conflict has shifted dramatically in recent decades, giving rise to what scholars call new wars, as distinct from the traditional or old wars. This transformation is characterized by several key factors that distinguish modern conflicts from their historical counterparts. Firstly, the primary actors in contemporary conflicts are often non-state entities rather than nation-states. Instead of organized military forces, we see a diverse array of groups such as rebel factions, religious militias, warlords, criminal organizations, and mercenaries engaged in combat. These groups form shifting alliances, often fighting both each other and the state, particularly in fragile or failed states where the government has lost its monopoly on violence. The structure of new wars tends to be decentralized, with multiple groups pursuing different objectives simultaneously. Modern communication technologies enable these factions to spread their messages, recruit combatants, and build political networks with unprecedented speed and reach. These conflicts frequently spill across borders, destabilizing neighboring countries and drawing in combatants and resources from around the world, including diaspora communities. The goals of new wars are predominantly identity-based. In contrast to the ideological or territorial motives of old wars, combatants often seek to restore perceived past glories or fulfill nationalistic aspirations, leading to the targeting of civilians and the commission of war crimes as deliberate strategies rather than unintended consequences. Financing for new wars comes from diverse external sources, as these non-state groups can't rely on taxation. Methods include involvement in international crime, human trafficking, drug and arms trade, illegal resource exploitation, kidnapping, and diverting humanitarian aid. Support from diaspora communities and sympathetic governments also plays a crucial role, often prolonging conflicts rather than hastening their resolution. This shift in the nature of warfare necessitates new approaches to conflict resolution and security analysis. Traditional models focused on state control over territory and military defense are inadequate for addressing the complex, multifaceted threats posed by new wars. Instead, a broader conception of human security is required, one that encompasses political, economic, social, and environmental factors. Policymakers must adapt their strategies to meet these new challenges, recognizing that conventional military responses may be insufficient or counterproductive. This may involve developing new international laws, addressing the economic underpinnings of conflicts, and focusing on non-military interventions and peace-building efforts that go beyond ceasefires or formal agreements. Acts that are considered criminal during peacetime often go unpunished when committed during wartime. However, it is critical to hold ruthless individuals accountable and establish some level of governance to protect endangered populations. Without such protections, vulnerable groups may turn to local militant organizations or arm themselves for self-defense. Several factors influence the prevention of violence and conflict contagion in war zones. The capacity of groups to mobilize potential audiences plays a significant role in determining whether they adopt violent or nonviolent strategies. Urban areas tend to have an advantage in mobilizing larger numbers due to population concentration and educational advantages. Ethnic groups can also mobilize effectively based on their shared identity. The size of mobilization impacts a group's choice of tactics and likelihood of success. Groups able to mobilize larger numbers are more likely to pursue nonviolent tactics, which are particularly effective when actions are public and expose participants to potential retaliation. As the number of active participants grows, individual risk decreases and effectiveness increases. Nonviolent groups also tend to recruit participants more easily than violent ones. Conversely, low participation often leads to the adoption of violent tactics. Groups unable to mobilize sufficient supporters may turn to violence as a comparative advantage. However, violence is generally unappealing to many people, which can limit mobilization. Some groups may grow larger after initial organization due to outside support, but they tend to have limited mobilization and operate in peripheral areas rather than cities. These findings have important implications for various stakeholders. States that repress active mobilization may inadvertently push groups towards violence. Or alternatively, states could consider conceding to sufficient group demands. Movements can broaden their appeal and disseminate their message to increase support and gain an advantage for nonviolent tactics. Other factors influencing conflict dynamics include the relative strength of rebel groups compared to state military forces, the control exercised by command structures, territorial control, and external support. The relationships among multiple level groups and their donors and insurgencies are also crucial variables. Transnational support can sustain groups beyond their own capacity, potentially prolonging conflicts and increasing fatalities and long-term costs. Violent conflicts never stem from a single factor, but arise from a complex interplay of political, social, and economic variables that limit people's life chances. These factors include closed political processes, marginalization of groups, youth unemployment, poverty, inadequate public services, human rights violations, and migratory flows. The weight of each factor varies depending on the specific situation. Violent conflict is fundamentally a failure of governance. Governments can be classified based on the degree of freedom they provide, ranging from autocracies with elite rule and few rights to democracies with rights and freedoms. The Polity Project rates countries on a scale from -10 most autocratic to +10 most democratic, with autocracies falling in the middle. Autocracies and unconsolidated democracies face similar levels of risk, while fully institutionalized democracies tend to be the most stable. Anocracies resulting from adverse regime changes toward autocracy often lack the strength to stabilize society through repression. More nuanced models suggest that partial democracies without factionalism and partial autocracies have higher likelihood of instability than full regime types. Partial autocracies are more prone to civil war and adverse regime change. Partial democracies with factionalism face the greatest risk of instability, with a significantly higher likelihood of civil wars and adverse regime changes compared to other government types. These findings highlight the complex relationship between governance structures and the risk of violent conflicts, emphasizing the importance of strong institutions and inclusive political processes in maintaining stability. State fragility, which refers to a government's ability to function effectively in the face of risks, is closely linked to violent conflict. Societies with unstable or weak governments are prone to internal violence or may become havens for external conflicts. The OECD's Fragility Framework assesses states across economic, environmental, human, political, security, and societal dimensions, using indicators such as GDP, rule of law, institutional transparency, human development, territorial control, and conflict levels. Alarmingly, 24% of the global population resides in fragile states, including 73% of those in extreme poverty. These individuals live in countries least equipped to protect or assist them. State fragility often leads to violent conflicts, coup attempts, and refugee crises, creating a cycle of instability and human suffering. Recent global trends indicate a concerning shift toward anocracy and autocracy rather than democracy. As of 2021, less than half the world's population lived under democratic rule. Simultaneously, inequality is on the rise, affecting over 70% of the global population. These trends are accompanied by an increase of violence worldwide. Such developments pose significant challenges to the stabilization of fragile states, creating an environment that is neither hopeful nor conducive to improvement. The combination of declining democratic governance, growing inequality, and escalating violence creates a complex web of issues that further exacerbate the fragility of vulnerable nations, making the path to stability increasingly difficult. Since World War II, a notable pattern has emerged. Political violence predominantly occurs in the world's poorest countries. These nations, characterized by vulnerable populations and weak infrastructure, struggle to manage conflicts effectively. Infant mortality, a sensitive indicator of development, is often high in these regions. Interestingly, the presence of natural resources increases the likelihood of civil war up to a certain point. These resources act as a magnet for rebel groups seeking to gain control, further destabilizing already fragile states. This complex interplay between poverty, underdevelopment, and resource wealth creates a volatile environment prone to political violence and civil unrest. Ethnic factionalism plays a significant role in state fragility and conflict. Countries experiencing factionalism are twice as fragile as those without it. When combined with partial democracy, ethnic factionalism, defined as sharply polarized and uncompromising competition, leads to the highest probability of state instability, particularly concerning civil war. While partial democracies without factionalism are no more prone to civil war than full democracies or autocracies, those with factionalism are 30 times more likely to experience ethnic and civil wars and adverse regime changes. State-led discrimination against minority religious groups triples the likelihood of civil war compared to states without religious restrictions. Such government restrictions often legitimize and correlate with the emergence of social hostilities. The attachment of emotive content to political concerns further increases volatility, as individuals may transfer loyalties among groups based on perceived common interests and values. Groups provide opportunities for individuals to express concerns, demonstrate issues' importance to the government, and have a voice in the political realm. However, when emotions define political action, it can become more contentious and divisive. This emotional component may lead to synergistic effect, gaining more acceptance among both active and previously inactive group members. Government actions are crucial in managing rising conflicts. Accommodation may be appropriate for single-issue demands, but in cases of multiple-issue activism, it may escalate conflict if seen as a reward. Repression might temporarily quell dissent if used to allow time for suitable accommodation, but alone it is likely to increase the transfer of motive content and loyalty away from the state to alternative sources of authority. If militant groups link to civil society groups during political turmoil, they may be emboldened to act out, legitimize force in conflict resolution, and pave the way for protracted social conflict. These protracted conflicts tend to devolve further into extremist violence, creating a cycle of instability and unrest. Contemporary civil and revolutionary conflicts often involve multiple rebel groups pursuing diverse goals, rather than a united front against the state. These goals may be comparable or conflicting, leading to inter-rebel violence. Such infighting might seem counterproductive, as it depletes resources that could be used against the government. However, it reflects the long-term competition for control among these groups. Factors influencing inter-rebel combat include drug production, territorial control, relative strength of rebel groups, and state weaknesses. Drug production is particularly associated with increased fighting among rebel groups, similar to criminal gangs competing for market control. Territorial control by one group doubles the likelihood of intergroup conflicts, while external support, especially from governments, also increases this probability. Understanding the dynamics of inter-rebel conflicts is crucial for comprehending contemporary civil wars. These conflicts can prolong wars and hinder post-conflict peacebuilding efforts. Treating rebel groups as a unified entity or failing to differentiate among them can be detrimental to conflict prevention, resolution, and peace establishment. Therefore, armed conflicts among rebel groups deserve as much attention as those between rebels and states. The concept of bad neighborhoods in international relations refers to regions where 4 or more neighboring countries experience violent conflict, creating areas of protracted instability. These environments significantly increase a country's vulnerability to conflict through various mechanisms. Conflicting parties may seek refuge or regroup in neighboring states, potentially spreading the conflict. especially when there are ethnic or ideological sympathizers across borders. Success in one country can embolden rebel groups to expand their activities into neighboring nations. Additionally, states may pursue rebel groups across borders or enlist neighboring governments' help to suppress rebellions. This interconnectedness of conflicts in a region can create a domino effect, perpetuating and expanding violence across multiple countries. Violent conflicts have far-reaching consequences beyond immediate loss of life and military expenditure. They profoundly impact social, political, and economic spheres, diminishing public health, mental well-being, educational attainment, child development, and investment capital. These effects often persist for decades, potentially fueling further conflict. Conflicts frequently spill over into neighboring countries, destabilizing entire regions. Conflict-affected countries specifically lag in achieving Millennium Development Goals, with students suffering from both reduced years and quality of education. Wars trigger humanitarian crises, creating millions of refugees and internally displaced persons living in substandard conditions for generations. The influx of refugees can destabilize fragile neighboring states, with international aid rarely offsetting costs. Long-term impacts include increased undernourishment, decreased GDP, and life expectancy, higher infant mortality, reduced educational attainment, and diminished access to clean water. Children in conflict zones face severe challenges that profoundly impact their physical and mental development. Malnutrition leads to stunting, while lack of education results in lost years of development. The UN Security Council has identified 6 grave violations against children in conflict: killing and maiming, recruitment as soldiers, sexual violence, attacks on schools or hospitals, denial of humanitarian access, and abduction. Children are increasingly used as soldiers and suicide bombers due to their unsuspecting nature. Reintegrating child soldiers is crucial for their rehabilitation and building lasting peace. However, some countries treat these children as security risks rather than victims, causing more harm. Millions of children are displaced, becoming refugees or internally displaced persons, facing high risk of abduction and sexual violence. In camps, they are vulnerable to infectious diseases, lack of basic necessities, and years of lost development. Addressing these issues requires a monumental international effort, as children are no longer just collateral damage, but often direct targets in conflicts. The cost of helping these victimized children is immeasurable, but necessary for their future and global stability. The concept of a conflict trap explains why some nations, particularly the poorest, remain in a cycle of recurring violence. Among the billion people at the bottom of the global economic period, 73% experienced civil wars in recent decades. Unlike conflicts that end decisively, wars in these regions tend to repeat, with fragile peace agreements often breaking down within months or years. Armed conflict leaves a country vulnerable, especially in the poorest nations. It exacerbates conditions such as limited employment, low economic growth, and poor physical, mental, and social development. These factors in turn increase vulnerability and motivate rebellion, creating a downward spiral that heightens the likelihood of further conflict. This self-reinforcing cycle traps nations in a persistent state of instability and violence. Sustainable Development Goal 16 emphasizes the creation of just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. This goal recognizes that governance, development, and conflict resolution strategies are intricately interconnected in the process of ending conflicts and establishing lasting peace. On a global scale, conflict plays a significant role in exacerbating various issues, including the spread of crime, drug trafficking, disease transmission, and terrorism. Addressing these challenges requires a comprehensive approach that integrates peace-building efforts with sustainable development initiatives. By focusing on building strong institutions, promoting the rule of law, and fostering inclusive societies, nations can work toward breaking the cycle of conflicts and creating a foundation for long-term stability and prosperity. The New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, proposed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the World Humanitarian Summit, offers a comprehensive blueprint for addressing conflict and fragility. Developed by members of the International Dialogue on Peacebuilding and State Building, including G7 countries, 19 fragile and conflicted affected nations, civil society, and development partners, this initiative aims to manage aid more effectively rather than simply targeting it. A key aspect of the New Deal is the International Dialogue, a forum that allows member countries and organizations to identify, propose, and coordinate measures to achieve peacebuilding, state building, and sustainable development goals. This platform pays a special attention to the roles of women and youth in these processes. The membership has agreed upon 5 peacebuilding and state building goals, 5 focus principles as action plans, and 5 trust principles for better coordination and resource management. The approach to maintaining peace differs based on a country's development status. For countries that have been developing successfully, the primary focus is on cushioning them from destabilizing shocks, particularly in financial ones. In these nations, political reforms are more critical than economic reforms, though they must be implemented cautiously to avoid increasing conflict risk. The key recommendation is to distribute power more equitably throughout society, protecting minority interests without deepening societal divisions. For poor but peaceful countries, economic policies take priority. While these nations may not be at war, the risk of conflict has been increasing. Certain strategies, such as increasing military spending or engaging in regional arms races, have proven ineffective or counterproductive. Instead, regionally brokered reduction in military spending are more effective in preventing conflict. Specific steps for conflict prevention include cutting off financial channels for rebellions, particularly by protecting natural resources from appropriation by rebel groups. Eliminating corruption and ensuring transparency and managing natural resource revenues are essential for maintaining public trust. The international community plays a crucial role in helping countries develop or adapt successful programs to meet these goals. Economic growth is particularly important for poor countries, with a 3% increase in growth rate nearly halving the incidence of violent conflict. Strategies such as diversifying economies, providing aid, implementing sound economic policy reforms, and ensuring market access have proven successful in promoting growth and stability. The Peacebuilding and State Building Goals, PSGs, focus on 5 key areas: fostering legitimate politics through inclusive settlements and conflict resolution, strengthening people's security, addressing injustices and improving access to justice, generating employment and improving livelihoods, and managing revenue for accountability and fair service delivery. The focus principles guide implementation, emphasizing regular fragility assessments, developing national visions, creating country-specific compacts, monitoring progress using PSGs, and supportive inclusive political dialogues. The trust principles ensure transparent aid use, risk management, strengthening of country systems, capacity building of civil and state institutions, and improving aid timeliness and predictability. These comprehensive goals and principles aim to create a framework for effective peace building and state budgeting in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Cutting off resources is crucial in bringing rebel groups to the negotiating table and ending conflicts. Fighting can be lucrative for rebel leaders, and access to funding increases their capacity to continue hostilities. Reducing access to commodity markets that enrich these groups can make war less appealing. While the drug trade remains difficult to eradicate, policies that reduce prices and illegal markets can diminish rebel funding. Remittances, the largest source of foreign aid, can unfortunately prolong wars when used to finance rebel and terrorist groups. Governments can address this by banning financial support to specific organizations and implementing improved policies for scrutinizing cash flows. These measures aim to control the flow of finances that fuel conflicts and encourage peaceful resolutions. Outside intervention in conflicts has yielded mixed results. While military support for rebels has sometimes shortened conflicts, external involvement often prolongs them. By providing troops, arms, or resources, outside support can extend fighting beyond the conflicting parties' original capacity, leading to longer conflicts with higher fatalities. External parties can also complicate negotiations if they disapprove of agreements or introduce their own interests. Additionally, involving other parties may hinder successful resolution if external supporters reject proposed agreements or interject their own agendas into the process. Consequently, the strategy and role of outside intervention, whether economic, military, or diplomatic, must be approached cautiously, considering its potential to either help or exacerbate the conflict situation. The pursuit of total peace requires compromise from all parties, not just those willing to disarm. However, diverse goals among rebel groups can lead to some accepting peace terms while others continue fighting. Research shows that rebel groups signing peace agreements are more likely to maintain peace, while non-signatories have twice the risk of post-settlement armed conflict. Contrary to common belief, partial agreements can effectively maintain peace between signatories and the government, with no significant difference in conflict likelihood compared to all-inclusive agreements. Although partial peace may reduce overall prospects for a complete peace, it significantly diminishes the scope of conflict. This finding is crucial as it demonstrates that partial peace is achievable and can substantially reduce loss of life and improve quality of life for potentially millions of people, even if it doesn't result in total peace. Escaping the conflict trap requires critical support from the international community during the first decade of peace. Two key priorities are demobilization and timely aid. Demobilization and reintegration of combatants are essential for building trust, but this process must be carefully managed. A legitimate external military presence is necessary initially, but it should not overstay its welcome. Demobilization should occur in stages, with community and family support playing crucial roles in reintegrating ex-combatants. Addressing trauma and providing psychological and social healing are important aspects of this process. Targeted interventions can help prevent demobilized combatants from turning to crime. The timing of aid is critical. While aid is typically highest in the immediate post-conflict years, its impact on growth is most significant in the 4th and 5th years. Early investment should focus on reforming social and structural policies. Infrastructure rebuilding is essential for growth, which is key to escaping the conflict trap. The diaspora community can play a vital role in post-conflict recovery, not only through remittances, but also by sharing skills and opportunities. Transparency throughout the process is crucial for maintaining legitimacy and building trust in the new peace. Overall, escaping the conflict trap requires a comprehensive, long-term approach that addresses both immediate security concerns and long-term economic and social development needs.